The golden afternoon sun bathed the emerald grasslands of the Masai Mara in warm light, creating a spectacular canvas of vibrant greens that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Dr. Elena Rodriguez adjusted her binoculars as she sat in the passenger seat of the rugged Land Cruiser, her weathered field notebook balanced on her knee. The 45-year-old wildlife biologist had spent the better part of 2 decades studying elephant behavior across East Africa, and the lush savanna around her represented everything she loved about this remarkable ecosystem. James Mwangi, her longtime research partner and one of the most experienced wildlife rangers in Kenya, guided their vehicle along the meandering game trails that crisscrossed the conservation area. His deep understanding of animal movements and seasonal patterns had made him invaluable to the East African Wildlife Research Institute, a dedicated organization focused on studying and protecting the region's magnificent creatures. The afternoon breeze carried the sweet scent of flowering grasses across the rolling hills, where ancient acacia trees stood like majestic umbrellas, providing shade for countless species. Elena had been documenting a particular elephant herd for 3 years, meticulously recording their social dynamics, migration patterns, and family structures. The matriarch, a magnificent female she had named Amara, led a group of 12 individuals through their traditional territory, with the wisdom that only came from decades of survival in the wild. The herd included several breeding females, adolescent males on the verge of leaving the family group, and 3 precious calves that represented the future of their lineage. As they approached a favorite observation point overlooking a vast expanse of grassland, Elena noticed something unusual in the distance. Through her binoculars, she could see a small gray form moving erratically near a cluster of fever trees separate from any adult elephants. Her heart began to race as she realized she was looking at a young elephant calf alone and clearly distressed in an environment where solitude meant almost certain death. James immediately recognized the significance of the sighting and carefully maneuvered their vehicle to a position where they could observe without disturbing the frightened animal. The calf appeared to be approximately 6 months old, based on its size and proportions, with the characteristic fuzzy hair that young elephants gradually lose as they mature. It was calling repeatedly with high-pitched trumpeting sounds that carried clearly across the still afternoon air. Elena felt her professional composure wavering as she watched the tiny elephant's desperate attempts to locate its family. The calf would walk a few steps in one direction, stop to call, then turn and try another direction, its trunk swaying frantically as it searched for familiar scents. Its small ears flapped continuously in a display of extreme agitation, and even from their distant observation point, the researchers could see that the young animal was becoming increasingly exhausted. The vast savanna that surrounded them, while breathtakingly beautiful, suddenly seemed impossibly large and dangerous from the perspective of a lost elephant calf. Elena knew that young elephants remained completely dependent on their mothers for nutrition guidance and protection during their first 2 years of life. Without the security of the herd, this vulnerable youngster faced threats from predators, dehydration, and starvation. James began a systematic scan of the surrounding area, searching for any sign of the main herd or other elephants that might be related to the orphaned calf. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, creating longer shadows across the grassland and adding urgency to their assessment of the situation. Time was not on their side, as the approaching evening would bring increased predator activity throughout the region. Elena documented every aspect of the calf's behavior in her notebook, noting its physical condition, movement patterns, and vocalizations. The young elephant showed clear signs of dehydration, with slightly sunken eyes and a listless quality to its movements that suggested it had been separated from its family for at least several hours, possibly longer. Its calls had become less frequent and more subdued, indicating that exhaustion was beginning to overcome its survival instincts. The 2 researchers faced a profound ethical dilemma that wildlife conservationists encounter regularly in their work. The fundamental principle of minimal intervention dictated that they should observe natural processes without interfering, allowing ecosystems to function according to their ancient rhythms. However, Elena's extensive experience had taught her to recognize situations where human intervention might be justified, particularly when dealing with young animals whose chances of survival were virtually non-existent without assistance. As they continued their observation, Elena noticed movement in the distance that made her blood run cold. A small group of spotted hyenas had appeared on a ridge approximately 1 kilometer away, their distinctive silhouettes clearly visible against the afternoon sky. The powerful scavengers and predators had obviously detected the distressed calls of the elephant calf and were beginning to investigate the source of the sounds. James immediately understood the implications of this development and began preparing for the possibility of immediate action. The land cruiser carried various emergency supplies, including flares, air horns, and other equipment designed to deter dangerous wildlife when necessary. However, both researchers knew that any intervention would need to be carefully planned and executed to avoid creating additional trauma for the already frightened calf. The hyenas moved with the confident gait of predators who had identified vulnerable prey, their powerful shoulders rolling as they descended from the ridge toward the isolated elephant. Elena counted 5 individuals in the group, including what appeared to be a mature female who was likely leading the hunt. Hyenas possessed incredibly strong jaws and worked cooperatively to bring down prey much larger than themselves, making them formidable opponents even for adult elephants under certain circumstances. Elena felt her heart racing as she watched the drama unfolding before them. The elephant calf had noticed the approaching predators and was attempting to move away from them, but its exhaustion was clearly limiting its mobility. The young animal's calls became more frantic, filled with a desperation that seemed to echo across the endless grassland and pierce directly through Elena's professional detachment. The spotted hyenas moved with deliberate precision across the green savanna, their muscular bodies built for endurance and their powerful jaws capable of crushing bones with ease. Elena watched through her binoculars as the pack spread out in a loose formation, instinctively employing hunting strategies that had been refined over thousands of years of evolution. The afternoon sun created stark shadows that emphasized the predators' confident movements as they closed the distance to their intended prey. The elephant calf's exhaustion was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. Its small trunk dragged along the ground occasionally, and its previously frantic movements had slowed to an unsteady walk. The young animal continued its distressed calling, but the trumpeting sounds had become weaker and more intermittent, suggesting that dehydration and fatigue were taking their toll on its ability to summon help. Elena felt her scientific objectivity crumbling as she observed the unfolding drama. Her decades of fieldwork had exposed her to countless examples of nature's harsh realities. But something about this particular situation resonated deeply with her maternal instincts. The elephant calf represented innocence and vulnerability in their purest forms, while the approaching hyenas embodied the merciless efficiency of natural selection. James methodically checked their emergency equipment while maintaining his visual surveillance of both the predators and their potential victim. The land cruiser's emergency kit included several marine-grade flares, multiple air horns of varying sizes, and a high-powered spotlight that could be effective even in daylight conditions. Additionally, they carried various research tools that could potentially be repurposed for wildlife deterrence if the situation demanded immediate action. The lead hyena, a stocky female with distinctive scarring around her muzzle, had moved to within 50 meters of the elephant calf when she suddenly stopped and began exhibiting the characteristic testing behavior that preceded most hyena attacks. She approached, slowly retreated, then approached again, gauging the young elephant's ability to defend itself and watching for signs of adult elephants in the vicinity. Elena realized that the predators were being unusually cautious in their approach, likely because elephants were not typical prey for hyenas. Adult elephants were capable of inflicting fatal injuries with their tusks, trunks, and feet, making them dangerous opponents even for coordinated predator groups. However, a lone calf presented an entirely different scenario, particularly one that was clearly weakened and separated from its protective family unit. The elephant calf detected the approaching danger and attempted to position itself near a large termite mound that offered some protection from multiple angles of attack. The young animal's survival instincts were functioning despite its exhaustion, but Elena could see that its movements lacked the coordination and speed that would be necessary to escape from determined predators. 2 of the younger hyenas began testing the calf's defenses by making short rushes toward it, then veering away at the last moment. This behavior served multiple purposes, including wearing down the prey animal's energy reserves and identifying potential weaknesses in its defensive posture. The elephant calf responded by turning to face each threat, but its reactions were becoming slower and less decisive. Elena felt an overwhelming surge of emotion as she watched the young elephant's desperate attempts to protect itself. The calf's small size and obvious vulnerability created a stark contrast with the confident aggression of the hunting predators. She found herself mentally urging the young animal to find hidden reserves of strength, even though her rational mind understood the likely outcome of the encounter. James made a decision that would alter the trajectory of their afternoon research expedition. He started the land cruiser's engine and began driving slowly but deliberately toward the confrontation, maintaining enough distance to avoid interfering with natural processes while positioning themselves for potential intervention if circumstances warranted immediate action. The sound of the approaching vehicle caught the attention of both predators and prey. The hyenas paused in their coordinated harassment of the elephant calf and turned to assess this new development. Their body language shifted from confident aggression to cautious evaluation as they tried to determine whether the humans represented a threat to their hunting activities. Elena prepared herself mentally for what might become the most ethically complex decision of her career. The scientific principles that had guided her work for 2 decades emphasized observation over intervention, but the desperate calls of the elephant calf seemed to appeal directly to her humanity rather than her professional training. The lead hyena resumed her approach toward the exhausted calf, apparently deciding that the distant humans posed no immediate threat to the pack's hunting success. Her companions followed her lead once again, spreading out to surround their intended victim. The elephant calf's defensive movements became more erratic as fatigue continued to undermine its ability to track multiple threats simultaneously. Elena watched as one of the younger hyenas made a more aggressive approach, actually making contact with the calf's hindquarters before retreating. The young elephant spun around to face this new threat, but the movement left it exposed to attacks from other directions. The pack was systematically wearing down their prey's defenses while avoiding the dangerous front end where the elephant's trunk could be used as a weapon. The afternoon sun continued its journey across the African sky, creating an almost surreal beauty that contrasted sharply with the life and death struggle playing out in the foreground. Elena found herself torn between her role as an objective scientific observer and her instinctive response to a vulnerable creature in desperate need of assistance. James brought the land cruiser to a stop approximately 100 meters from the developing confrontation, close enough to intervene rapidly if necessary, but far enough away to avoid immediately disrupting the natural process. Both researchers understood that their next actions would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The elephant calf's calling had become almost continuous, a heartbreaking soundtrack that seemed to fill the vast savanna with its desperate message. Elena knew that these vocalizations served multiple purposes, including attempts to locate family members and warnings to potential threats, but in the current situation, they primarily expressed the young animal's terror and exhaustion. Elena felt something fundamental shift within her as she watched the hyenas tighten their circle around the exhausted elephant calf. The professional distance that had sustained her through years of wildlife research suddenly seemed inadequate in the face of such raw vulnerability. She realized that some moments transcend scientific protocols and demand responses that come from deeper wells of human compassion. James seemed to understand her internal struggle without the need for words. His own expression had grown increasingly tense as he observed the developing situation, and Elena could see that he was also grappling with the conflict between professional obligations and moral imperatives. The two researchers had worked together long enough to develop an almost telepathic understanding of each other's thoughts and motivations. The decision to intervene came suddenly and decisively. James reached for the emergency air horn, while Elena prepared one of their marine-grade flares, both of them moving with the coordinated efficiency that comes from years of partnership in challenging field conditions. The land cruiser lurched forward as James pressed the accelerator, sending them racing across the green grassland toward the confrontation. The sound of the approaching vehicle and the blast of the air horn created immediate chaos among the hunting hyenas. The pack's confident coordination dissolved as individual animals made independent decisions about whether to continue their attack or retreat from this unexpected human intervention. The lead female held her ground for several crucial seconds before finally turning and loping away from the elephant calf. Elena fired a flare high into the afternoon sky, where it burst into brilliant red sparks that scattered across the blue canvas above them. The explosive sound and visual display provided additional motivation for the remaining hyenas to abandon their hunting attempt and retreat to a safe distance. Within moments, the predators had melted away into the tall grass, their distinctive shapes barely visible as they moved toward the rocky outcroppings that dotted the landscape. The elephant calf stood trembling near its termite mound refuge, clearly traumatized by the extended confrontation but still alive and uninjured. Its small trunk swayed weakly as it tried to process the sudden change in its circumstances, and Elena could see that the young animal was operating purely on survival instincts at this point. James brought their vehicle to a gentle stop approximately 30 meters from the calf, close enough to provide protection, but far enough away to avoid adding additional stress to an already traumatized animal. Both researchers understood that their intervention had only addressed the immediate threat, and that the fundamental problem of an orphaned elephant calf remained unresolved. Elena began documenting the calf's physical condition in greater detail, noting signs of dehydration, exhaustion, and stress while trying to assess its overall health prospects. The young elephant's eyes appeared sunken, indicating significant fluid loss, and its movements lacked the energetic quality that characterized healthy calves. However, there were no obvious injuries or signs of serious illness that might complicate recovery efforts. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the savanna, reminding both researchers that time remained a critical factor in determining the calf's survival chances. Young elephants required regular nursing and could not survive extended periods without maternal care, making rapid reunification with an appropriate herd absolutely essential. James began a systematic radio check with other research teams and ranger stations throughout the region, hoping to locate reports of elephant herds that might be missing young members. The East African Wildlife Research Institute maintained an extensive network of field personnel who regularly monitored wildlife populations and movements, creating opportunities for coordinated rescue and reunification efforts. Elena continued her behavioral observations, while James handled communications, noting that the calf's calling patterns had changed significantly since the hyena threat disappeared. The young animal's vocalizations had become more structured and purposeful, suggesting that its stress levels were beginning to decrease, and that its natural behavior patterns were reasserting themselves. The researchers established a mobile veterinary station using supplies from their emergency kit, preparing to provide basic medical care if the situation demanded immediate intervention. Elena had extensive training in wildlife first aid and had successfully treated various injured animals throughout her career, though she had never dealt with an orphaned elephant calf under field conditions. James received encouraging news from his radio contacts. A ranger team approximately 15 kilometers to the southeast had reported unusual elephant activity that morning, including extended periods of calling and agitated movement patterns that could indicate a herd searching for missing members. The timing and location of these observations aligned well with the discovery of the orphaned calf. Elena felt a surge of hope as she processed this information. Elephants possessed remarkable memories and strong family bonds that could persist even when individuals became temporarily separated from their groups. If the southeastern herd was indeed the calf's original family, there was a realistic possibility that reunification could be achieved with careful planning and execution. The decision to transport the calf to the potential reunion site required careful consideration of multiple factors, including the young animal's stress tolerance, transportation safety, and the likelihood of successful family acceptance. Elena knew that elephant social structures were complex and that introducing unfamiliar individuals to established herds could sometimes result in rejection or aggression. James modified their Land Cruiser to create a secure but comfortable transport area for the elephant calf, using research equipment and emergency supplies to construct a temporary enclosure that would prevent injury during travel. The process required patience and creativity, as standard vehicles were not designed to accommodate elephant passengers of any size. Elena approached the calf slowly and calmly, using techniques she had learned from experienced elephant handlers to minimize stress and encourage cooperation. The young animal initially showed signs of fear and confusion, but gradually began responding to her gentle movements and soothing vocal tones. The process of gaining the calf's trust required nearly an hour of careful interaction. The loading process proved challenging, but ultimately successful, with the exhausted calf eventually accepting the security of the makeshift transport enclosure. Elena provided small amounts of water using techniques appropriate for dehydrated elephant calves, while James began the careful journey toward the location where the searching herd had been reported. The drive across the savanna took nearly 2 hours as James maintained speeds that prioritized passenger safety over arrival time. Elena monitored the calf continuously during transport, documenting its responses to the journey. and watching for signs of medical complications that might require immediate attention. As they approached the coordinates provided by the ranger team, Elena felt her excitement building alongside her professional anxiety. The success or failure of their intervention would be determined within the next few hours, and she understood that they had committed themselves to seeing this rescue attempt through to its conclusion regardless of the outcome. The sound of elephant calls drifted across the grassland as they crested a low hill, confirming that a herd was indeed present in the vicinity. James positioned their vehicle where they could observe the elephants while maintaining enough distance to avoid disrupting the group's natural behavior patterns. Elena counted 11 elephants of various ages, including 2 other calves that appeared to be slightly older than their rescued passenger. The herd's behavior exhibited clear signs of distress and searching activity, with frequent calling and restless movement patterns that supported the theory that they were missing a family member. The critical moment arrived as Elena and James carefully released the young calf from its transport enclosure and watched as it took its first tentative steps toward the waiting herd. The afternoon sun created a golden backdrop for what would either be a triumphant reunion or a heartbreaking rejection. The response from the elephant herd was immediate and unmistakable. A mature female broke away from the group and rushed toward the approaching calf, her trunk extended and her body language expressing intense recognition and relief. The reunion was accompanied by a symphony of trumpeting calls that seemed to celebrate the restoration of their family unit. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the young calf disappear into the protective circle of its family, surrounded by gentle touches and reassuring sounds that confirmed its acceptance and safety. The herd gradually calmed as the crisis of separation resolved itself, and normal behavioral patterns began to reassert themselves. James documented the successful reunification with both written notes and photographic evidence, creating a permanent record of their intervention and its positive outcome. The East African Wildlife Research Institute would use this case study to refine their protocols for similar situations that might arise in the future. As the elephant family moved away across the green savanna, Elena reflected on the events that had transformed a routine research expedition into a profound lesson about the intersection of scientific objectivity and human compassion. The setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, creating a fitting conclusion to an afternoon that had reaffirmed her commitment to wildlife conservation. The young calf looked back once from its position within the protective herd, and Elena chose to interpret that glance as a final acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them during those critical hours when his survival had depended on their willingness to act beyond the boundaries of conventional research protocols.